Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's expert lecture. My name is Natasha Baker and I'm the Marketing Manager at Golden Eagle Luxury Trains. And I'm delighted to be joined today by our expert speaker, Sophie Ibbotson, who will be transporting us back to the 14th century to delve into what was the legacy of Tamerlane, the infamous Turkic conqueror. So for those of you who are planning to travel with us on one of our luxury rail journeys through Central Asia, this lecture will look back at the history that indelibly shaped many of the destinations that we visit along these routes. As a recognised Central Asia expert, Sophie is a consultant for the World Bank and the governments of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. And she's also Uzbekistan's ambassador for tourism and has travelled extensively throughout this region. As a writer, Sophie has authored multiple travel guides, and she's a regular contributor to titles including Lonely Planet, The Telegraph, and The Economist. And we've had the pleasure of her travelling with us as a guest speaker on many of the Golden Eagle Silk Road journeys. So it's a pleasure to have her back with us presenting for you today. So thank you again for joining us, and I will now gladly hand over to Sophie Ibbotson.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Thank you to all of the Golden Eagle team for inviting me here this evening. And I'm very excited to be lecturing to you in your living rooms. Obviously, it would be ideal if we were all on board the Golden Eagle right now, having an adventure to somewhere terribly exciting. But I hope this is the next best thing and will whet your appetite for a journey along the Silk Road as soon as the restrictions allow. Talk this evening is the Legacy of Tamerlane. And I want to start with this painting that you see on the slide. And it's a painting by a Polish artist called Stanislaw Chabowski. He painted it in the late 19th century, and he specialised in Oriental themes. The picture is of Sultan Bajazeth, who has been imprisoned by Tamerlane. And it's a really exoticized scene with little historical accuracy. But it's based on a largely fictional view of Amir Timur, who is the protagonist of tonight's talk. The man we have to thank or to blame, depending on your opinion, for the popularization and sensationalization of Timur's story in Europe. His play, Tamerlane the Great, was written in 1587, and it's one of the most famous pieces of his Elizabethan drama. Now, like Shakespeare, who was his rough contemporary, Marlowe wanted a hero for his plays, and he plucked one straight out of history. Now, we know obviously with Shakespeare, he picked King Richard and the Henrys for his histories, but Marlowe went a little bit further afield, and he picked Amir Timur. Now, he took this story and he embellished it almost to the point that it was unrecognisable. He definitely used his artistic license, and yes, there were a few historical details that he got right, but more it was about impressing his audience with the excitement that was going on and creating an entire world around Timur. This is what influenced Europe and what shaped many of today in poetry, in drama, in film. We all go back to Marlowe. What I'm really interested, though, in is the individual, Amir Timur himself. And I want to talk about him as an actual historical individual, what he did, where he went, and the influence that he had. Here he is, not the prettiest creature, but this is probably the most accurate physical representation that we have of Timur. And it's a facial skull, which was excavated from his tomb in the 20th century by the Soviets. And this is what we think probably he looked like. Now, Timur was born in 1336 in Kesh, which is now the UNESCO World Heritage City of Shahrisabz, just to the south of Samarkand in modern Uzbekistan. I've called the lecture Tamerlane, but had you met Timur during his lifetime, you certainly wouldn't have called him that. Tamerlane is the Anglicisation, a corruption of Timur-i-Lem. Timur was his name and Lem meant lame. So Tamerlane is Tamerlane, sorry, is Timur, who is lame, or Timur with the limp. It was an insult, but it was true. Timur had been afflicted with a childhood injury of some kind, and it was recorded in the chronicles at the time, but also when they excavated his body in the 20th century, the remarks on his skeleton to suggest there is physical evidence of that injury as well. So when we call him Tamerlane, that is the insult that his enemies would have used. In his lifetime, he would have been Amir Timur, for a king or a ruler, and Timur was his actual name. Timur was born into the Barlas Confederation, which was a Turco-Mongol clan in Central Asia. He wasn't a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, but he saw himself as Genghis Khan's political heir and the man who could restore the Mongol Empire, the glory days of the past. He certainly made a good job of it. The map on your screens now shows the extent of the Timurid Empire at the end of Timur's life. He stretched his territories well into Turkey, to what is now Syria, to Aleppo, south to Baghdad in Iraq, all the way through Iran, Afghanistan, what is now Pakistan, and into northern India, going as far east as Delhi, and then pushing up to the north, all across Central Asia, into Kazakhstan and sort of the southern parts of Russia. At the time of his death, he was planning to invade into China as well. And in preparation, he had already made an alliance with some of the Mongol tribes from Mongolia. And his plan was that he would attack from the south, that the Mongols from Mongolia would attack from the north, and there would be a pincer movement on China that the Chinese couldn't possibly resist. He died actually before he was able to achieve. Interesting to wonder how history might have looked quite different had he actually been successful and conquered China as well. If we summarize Timur's military style, I think probably the best way of describing it is that it was brutal, but it was effective. Just like Genghis Khan, who he modelled himself on, he was a very skilled strategist and leader, and he made sure that the people within his army were able to communicate their ideas directly, their expertise, whether they were siege specialists, whether they were experts in explosions, whether they were cavalry, whether they were weapons makers. And he made sure that all of these skills were put to good use. And it didn't matter really who he was fighting, whether it was the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt in the west or the Sultan of Delhi in the east. He could turn his tactics, he could anticipate what his enemies would do, and he could flatten them completely on the battlefield. And in fact, during his lifetime, it is said that he was never defeated, which really is quite a remarkable situation to be in. The problem was, at least if you were being attacked by Timur and his army, was that there was a great human cost. Yes, he was a great military leader and achieved a great deal in that respect, but people died as a result. The position that he took when he attacked or was approaching a city was either you submit to me or you will die. And there was a strategy in this too, because it built up his reputation as being somebody completely fearsome. And if you knew he was coming, rather than trying to resist and to hold up and sort of survive a siege, it was better to just give up straight away, to accept his terms, to roll over. If you did resist, unfortunately, sooner or later, the Timur's army was going to destroy you. It is estimated that as many as 17 million people died at the swords of Timur's armies, and that represents 5% of the world's population at the time. Accounts of his troops leaving behind pyramids of skulls, of complete towns wiped out, not only the people, but also the land then contaminated with salt so that nothing would grow. And the idea behind it as with sort of threatening people not to try and besiege or attempting to survive a siege, was that you have a choice. And it is, from the Timurids' point of view, much easier for you to give up straight away. So the threat and the risk of being completely destroyed is not something that many smaller rulers would have wanted to countenance. It was far better for them to give up before the army even arrived, to open the gates, to welcome the spoils, to give them the territory, perhaps to even have some form of alliance with them, because at least then you would retain your lives and perhaps a position as a governor or some sort of a localized power. Now, what Timur was incredibly good at was extending his territory to acquire new territories. What he wasn't so good at was introducing the administrative systems to actually maintain them. And this is something, unfortunately, that Genghis Khan also failed at as well. Very, very good at acquiring territory, not so much at keeping it. When Timur died in 1405, this meant that the empire he had created quickly fragmented into a large number of smaller states, including the Mughal Empire in South Asia. There was no way of keeping control of such a huge area once it had been acquired. There was no way of administering it, no way of taxing it, no way of keeping an eye on all of the regional governors. So it's inevitable, really, seized their opportunity to regain their own sovereignty in their particular local area. What this means is that the cultural legacy of Timur and the Timurid Empire far exceeded and outlasted his military achievements. And the second part of my talk is really going to be about that cultural. That is what you will be able to see and appreciate if you go to Central Asia today. Timur was a military leader, but he was also an incredible patron of architecture. He used the stability that he had acquired through his military conquests to usher in a renaissance in Central Asia. The first, an ancient one, probably almost 1500 years before Timur, when Central Asia was at the heart of the Silk Road, but he saw it that he could use his power, he could use his wealth, and he could use the artisans and architects at his disposal to create an entire new identity and really celebrate what he had achieved. It was about creating a lasting legacy that would be remembered long after his death. The picture that you see here is from Shahrazabs, the city which is the modern incarnation of Kesh, where he was born. And Timur decided that it was very, very important to have monuments in his birthplace to remind everybody that this is where he came from. The building in front of you on the screen is the Aksaray, which means the White Palace. And this was the most important of all of the monuments that he constructed there. The part that you see on the screen is just the gateway to the palace. It is 65 meters tall, the part that is left of it, but it would have been topped with an archway of some kind and had an entire palace behind. The rest of the palace hasn't survived, just the archway, just the gateway. But you can see from the scale of the people in the foreground of the photo just how extraordinarily huge this building would have been, and the impression that it would have made on people who had come from villages and small towns where the tallest building would have been 2 or 3 stories high, to come to Shahrazabs to see this, completely in awe of it, and of course of the man who created it. Timur understood the power that architecture would have. It was a way of demonstrating his control on the natural world and of physics, quite frankly. by building something larger and more impressive than people even thought possible. Although it's not visible in this particular picture, there is an inscription on the Aksaray in the calligraphy which says, "If you challenge our power, look at our buildings." In other words, if we can do this, we can do anything. Now, as much as Timur loved Shahrisabz, he loved his homeland, actually in the region he was quite insignificant. It was the equivalent of being born in Southampton, as I was, but knowing that Salisbury and Winchester were just up the road, places which had much greater cultural and cachet, quite frankly. There was only so much frou-frouing that he could do to Shahrisabz. So if he really wanted to make his mark on the world and present himself as a king of culture and a king of history, he needed a capital which was far more fitting of his position. Just up the road was Samarkand, and this had been the ancient capital of the region, and he decided that he was going to make Samarkand the capital of his empire too. Some of the pictures you can see here, the Shahi Zinda and the Bibi Khanum Mosque, in the present day, and they absolutely dazzle everybody who visits Samarkand, and reasons that the city has UNESCO World Heritage status. But if you think back 600 years, quite what an impression they would have made. They're marvelous enough for us now, but 600 years ago, again, as with the Aksaray and Shahrisabz, this would have been extraordinary. You've never seen anything like it. Wonder again about the man who made these buildings. The buildings you see in Samarkand are not just beautiful, but they were at the very forefront of engineering, of innovation in material science, and of the decorative arts as well. There were ribbed domes, double domes, and structures of great weight. And in fact, at the Bibi Khanum Mosque, the building in the top right, Timur imported the elephants all of the way from India to do the heavy lifting on his building. He didn't have cranes at the time, but elephants apparently do the job just as well. Building a city required the greatest minds, the greatest creative minds, but also the greatest mathematical minds of the day. And Timur brought these people from all across his empire, from Turkey, from Iran, from Iraq, from India. He brought them all to Samarkand to design and to build the monuments that would be his lasting legacy. This is one of the reasons that Samarkand became the center of the Renaissance in Central Asia, because all of these intellectuals, all of these incredibly clever, experienced people with international experience and understanding all came together in one place. I'll come back to them a little bit later. One of the most famous Samarkand is the Guri Amir that you see here, and this is the mausoleum of Timur himself. The Guri Amir quite literally means the tomb of the king. It was built in 1403, 2 years before Timur died, and it was originally planned for his grandson, who Timur had hoped would be his heir, but sadly predeceased Timur. Timur was buried there 2 years after his grandson, because he died unexpectedly early on his campaign when he was planning to visit, to conquer China, and the body was then brought back to. So he was entombed within the mausoleum with a solid block of jade over the top of his grave. There are two interesting things about this particular building that fascinate me. And the first is that the building was the architectural precursor for a number of other hugely important mausoleums built later across, Central and South Asia. I mentioned earlier that the Mughal Empire in South Asia was a sort of a successor empire to the Timurids. Babur, who was the founder of the Mughals, actually came from the Fergana Valley in what is now Uzbekistan. He had tried twice to reacquire Samarkand because of its links with Timur, but when he failed, he turned his attention to the south, first to Kabul and then to Delhi. And he took with him the idea of these buildings, and his own tomb in Kabul is considered the next stage in mausoleum design, the next evolutionary step of the architecture. So we have a step from the Guri Amir in Samarkand to Babur's tomb in Kabul, then from Babur's tomb to Humayun's tomb in Delhi, which many of you will already have seen, and then from Humayun's tomb to the Taj Mahal. So if you are an architectural historian, you can trace the evolution of the tombs through these 4 incredibly important architectural monuments. The second thing which really interests me about Timur's tomb is this, and this is his final resting place. Actually, although it looks like the body might be here, the body is in a crypt beneath the floor. This is the jade block which is above, and which as a tourist you were able to see. There is one of the inscriptions there, in fact 2 of the inscriptions which are on the tomb. When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble. And the second, whoever disturbs my tomb will unleash an invader more terrible than I. So he was clearly trying to put people off digging around and seeing what might be inside. I mentioned to you earlier on in the talk, though, when I showed you the reconstruction of his face and mentioned about his limp, that in the 19th century, sorry, in the 20th century, the tomb was excavated and the body was disturbed. And this has led to what is called the Curse of Timur. And a lot of people in Samarkand in particular do take this seriously, and they are very, very worried about the Curse of Timur. The first sort of case we have in history of the curse being recorded is when the Persian conqueror Nadir Shah came to Samarkand in 1740. When he tried to open the sarcophagus, it cracked into 2 pieces. And the people who were with Nadir Shah thought that this was a really bad omen, and they convinced him to leave it untouched. The tomb was, however, opened in the Soviets on the 20th of June, 1941. They didn't believe in the superstition. However, as those of you who know your Soviet and indeed Nazi history will know, this is just 2 days before Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. It is said that Stalin, when this happened, Stalin heard about the curse and believed it to be true, and he therefore ordered that Timur's remains be returned to the crypt as soon as was possible. It may be that this did indeed appease the ghost of Timur, because 1 month after Timur was finally reburied in his original resting place, the Soviets were victorious at Stalingrad, or so the story goes. Having concentrated so many great minds in Samarkand, it was probably natural that both Samarkand and the nearby city of Bukhara became cities of learning. The Timurid madrasas, the religious schools, were universities which rivaled those in Baghdad and were well ahead of Oxford and Cambridge in their understanding of topics including the Ulugh Madrasa, which you see on the left-hand side of this picture, which is of the Registan, the most famous square in Samarkand, was built by Timur's grandson. But it was Timur who had laid the foundations of the scholarly community within Samarkand. And he also made it possible that a Timurid ruler could follow on intellectual inquiry, research and patronage of the arts, rather than being always at war. The discoveries made in Timurid Samarkand reached Europe. What you're looking at here is the Meridian Arc in Ulugh astronomical observatory, which was discovered by archaeologists in the 20th century and re-excavated. Now, Ulugh was a phenomenal astronomer, a phenomenal mathematician, and the star catalogue he created was actually used by Tycho Brahe, who many of you will have heard of as one of the most famous medieval astronomers in Europe. Although Copernicus's calculations of the length of the sidereal year was 28 seconds more accurate than that of Ulugh, actually Ulugbeg's measurement of the tropical year was more precise. So we can see the research he did actually, in some case, centuries ahead of his European counterparts, I suppose, was very a crater on the moon and a belt of asteroids have been named after him in recognition of his contribution to astronomical knowledge. The influence of the Timurids, however, and Timur in particular, wasn't just on science. The character of Timur, both real and fictionalized, fascinated and horrified measure. It inspired, of course, Marlowe's play, which I mentioned earlier on in my talk, but also operas by Handel and Vivaldi. Timur appears as a character in Puccini's Turandot, and he's there in a poem by Edgar Allan Poe. Those of you who are video games enthusiasts may also be interested to know that in Age of Empires 2, you can even have a Tamerlane campaign. Now, when Uzbekistan became independent in 1991, the country, which includes not only the cities of Shak, but also other Silk Road centres such as Khiva and Bukhara, the country had to create a national identity for itself. Inherited were not those of any historic empire. They were defined by the Soviets, and particularly by Stalin, in the early 20th century. This meant that Uzbekistan's couldn't naturally align itself with historic civilizations, but they did look to the past for inspiration. And they chose as a national hero because both his birthplace and his capital were in Uzbekistan. It isn't correct to say that Timur was an Uzbek. He wasn't. That wasn't an identity that he even would have been necessarily aware of. He was from the Barlas clan, he was a Turco-Mongol, and his influence stretched far beyond the modern nation state of Uzbekistan. His birthplace and his capital within the country's borders, including the great monuments, which make them such impressive places to visit. I think Timur really was quite a natural choice for Uzbekistan, and certainly Uzbekistan has a greater claim to him as a hero than any of the neighbouring countries. Timur's legacy stretches and is felt from Turkey to India, but you will sense it strongly, most strongly in Uzbekistan, and it is there probably because of the physical legacy, the cultural legacy that he has, that he is seen as a hero. One of the things I did in preparation for this talk was on my @UZambassador Twitter feed, asked people whether they thought Timur was a hero or a villain. And there was a point actually this morning where we had a Brexit split of 52-48% on this. As the day went on, I think possibly the Uzbeks had all jumped in, and we did have a sort of a 2/3, 1/3 split in favour of Timur being a hero. But that reflects what he did in that particular. I talk to Indians in particular. The image that they have of Timur is of a horrendous character who days and people. And I imagine that there are other communities elsewhere, particularly in the sort of further west, where again, that is the view people have of him. It suited the Europeans to have this hero-villain dichotomy. But what I have learned from studying him, and particularly of traveling within Uzbekistan and other parts of Central Asia, is that the truth of Timur is far more complex. Yes, he is a hero. Yes, he did fantastic things. Yes, he is a villain. Yes, he massacred extraordinary numbers of people and devastated cities, some which never recovered. He can be both of those things. And that's what makes him such an exciting historical figure to learn about. Natasha, are you there? I think I will hand back to you, and possibly we can do some Q&A.
I am here. Thank you very much for that. No, it's incredible to see the actual scale of influence that he had over this region. I think even obviously when you travel to this region, you can take in so much from when you travel, but then to hear it again. So I think even that people that have joined us today who've traveled in this region would have really enjoyed that lecture. So thank you very much for that. As we mentioned at the start, we have some time for some questions, so I will answer those. You can send them using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, so please send those through if you have any. We had one come through that just asked, how did Amir Timur die? I don't think you mentioned that earlier. Was it in battle or was it of natural causes?
He was wounded in battle and then seems to have died from his injuries. We won't know exactly what happened. I imagine probably of the wounds that he injured. But the plan originally had been that he would be buried in Shahrasabz in his birthplace. But it was winter and there is quite a high mountain pass between Samarkand and Shahrasabz. So they wouldn't have been able to get the body back to Shahrasabz before it had started to decompose and go nasty. And that is why they decided to bury him in the tomb in Samarkand that had already been prepared for his grandson. And actually it became a family necropolis after that. There are various other male relatives buried. The women of the Timurid dynasty, including the sort of wives, I think his mother and various sort of sisters and nieces, are buried in the Shahi Zinda necropolis, which is also in Samarkand. And that's probably the best tiles, mosaic tiles of anywhere on the Silk Road, and is one of the other great monuments of Samarkand.
I think that's what's even more incredible is that the pictures that you showed in your presentation, I mean, how they were incredibly beautiful to look at, but they still don't even do them justice, do they? The tiles, when you see them in real life and you see the architecture, is just phenomenal. And I think that's what he's obviously, you know, he was successful in achieving that legacy that he wanted. So
I've probably been to the Shahi Zinda now 15 times, something like that, in every time of day. And whenever I want to go, because I don't think I've ever seen anywhere more beautiful. And it always looks different depending on the light, depending on the time of year. You always see new details. It's just probably my favorite place on the planet. It's absolutely extraordinary.
No, and with good reason as well, definitely. We've had quite a few questions come through here, so I'll just run through as many as I can. The first one just was asking about about our journeys, and I guess which journeys go through the areas that you've mentioned. Samarkand features in all of our Silk Road journeys. So we have, at the moment, we have 3 Silk Road journeys. We have the core Silk Road journey that goes between Beijing and Moscow. We also have the journey that departs, a shorter variation that departs from Almaty in Kazakhstan and finishes in Moscow. So both of those journeys feature Samarkand. We also have a brand new journey for April 2022, which is the Republics of the Silk Road. And that includes all 5 Stan countries. And it includes Shahrasabz, as we were talking about earlier, as was been mentioned in this presentation. So that, as well as Samarkand. So the Republics of the Silk Road visits many of the destinations that Sophie's talked about in today's lecture. So there's more information on our website about that, but please do follow up with us by email and I can answer any more questions you have on the journeys themselves. Then just a couple of questions about Amir Timur himself. So there was a question here, just where did he spend most of his life? And obviously I know you explained before that modern day Uzbekistan is slightly different from how it was before, but if you could give us an idea of that.
I would say, I mean, after his youth, Timur spent almost his entire life on campaign. You've seen in the map the extent of the empire, and we have to remember the time that it would have taken to travel that far at the time. It wasn't a case of just jumping on a flight to Delhi or to Aleppo. Sometimes these campaigns were years at a time. And a large part of that was not fighting battles, it was walking or riding to travel that distance. And so he returned to Samarkand periodically between campaigns, but never for very long. Most of his life would have been spent on the road, either in battle, preparing for battle, or besieging other people. There was very little time for him to sit around and to enjoy life. His sons and his grandsons did, until the empire started deteriorating. But for him, it was a life of warfare, and he was almost all of his life really on the road.
Which I think answers one of the other questions that came through, asking whether Timur or the sort of people around him, did they live in palaces within Samarkand, or were they, I suppose, more nomadic and like the Mongols? And I guess you've answered that question in that sense.
So they would have been, they weren't really, they were nomadic when they were on campaign. The fact that he did build cities and build permanent structures sets him apart from the Mongols 100 or so years earlier, who were not really city builders. We don't have great monuments associated with Genghis Khan. He moved and didn't really have a designated capital in the same way that Timur had Samarkand. Genghis Khan never invested in building physical infrastructure or building monuments, but Timur recognized that these were important, and possibly he learned them from other empires he encountered, perhaps in Iran and in Iraq, that actually buildings are an important way of stating that you are the most wealthy and most powerful person around.
And yeah, he did a good job with those buildings that, you know, he delivered for sure. So I'm just having a look through more questions here. We have an interesting question about the story that you told when the Soviets opened his tomb, and did they do, or do you know if they did any testing on the corpse when they did that?
I don't know in terms of genetic, any sort of DNA extraction. I mean, I think we're looking back, it's the 1940s, so obviously the tests that they could have done then are very limited compared to what we would be able to do now. Do a lot of measurements, and that's how, for example, they were able to do the reconstruction of what he looked like based on his skull, how they were able to identify the injury. So they did study him and record him in quite some detail, and also the layout of the crypt and other items that were in there. But it's certainly not the level of testing that we would do if we were excavating it today.
And obviously you've travelled extensively within Central Asia, but in Uzbekistan specifically. There's a couple of questions here, people who I guess are asking how safe it is to travel to Samarkand, and how would you respond to that?
So for foreign travellers, it is incredibly, incredibly safe. People often ask me in particular, what's it like for solo women travellers? And actually, I would say it's one of the safest places I've ever been as a solo woman traveller. There was so I've forgotten what the big international polling company is, who did a survey of sort of destinations a few years back, and they actually found Uzbekistan was in the top 5 safest destinations. So as a tourist, you are highly unlikely to have any sort of problems. It's almost unheard of for any sort of harassment, pickpocketing, anything like that, which you might associate with some other destinations. These things just don't happen. The problems that tourists do have, occasional problems with sort of traffic accidents. I took a group of a few got heat stroke because it can be very, very hot in the summer, but that could happen anywhere. I mean, it's not specific to the destination. You just, in the case of the heat, wear a hat, stay in a hotel at lunchtime if it's too hot.
Yeah, no, I think what I was incredibly taken aback by in Uzbekistan was just the incredible friendliness of everybody, and they were so welcoming and so accommodating. You know, there was nothing, like I said, I felt so safe there and just so welcome. There was no, you know, couldn't do enough for you, and I thought that was, you definitely get that impression from everyone that you meet over there.
Bukhara and Khiva in particular have both got extensive old towns which are largely pedestrianised. And I never have any problem if I've got groups. I say to them, yes, absolutely, you can go out after dinner. It doesn't matter that it's dark. Just look out in case there's a sort of a piece of paving missing or a pothole or something. But in terms of your personal safety, don't worry about it at all. You can wander to your heart's content. And if you get lost, just ask somebody and they'll point you back in the right direction to your hotel. So that is a really nice thing, particularly if you're used to traveling in other parts of maybe South Asia or the Middle East, where sometimes you're looking over your shoulder if you're on public transport or if you're in a crowded area. You don't have to worry about that in Uzbekistan.
Do we know what his approximate age was, and do we know how he acquired the limp that he carried from a child?
Well, he died in 1405. So he was, I will just check when he was born, because I did have it in my notes. In terms of the injury, it's not entirely clear, but there is a suggestion that possibly as a young man, probably as a teenager, that he was on some sort of raid that went wrong, and he got shot with an arrow in his leg. So that is possibly what happened. And the injury seems to have been similar. So according to my notes here, so he was born in 1336 and he died in 1405. So for the time, that would have been quite a good lifestyle. And particularly given that he was always on the battlefield, the fact that somebody hadn't managed to shoot him first or knock him down with a sword earlier was quite impressive. When I say shoot, of course, I mean with an arrow, not with a shotgun. Yes. Several centuries too early for that.
Oh, definitely. There's a specific question here. Just says, Amir Timur's spiritual mentor was a Sufi saint called Amir Kulal. The story goes he wanted to be buried near him when he died. And is that the case? Is he buried in the tomb that you mentioned earlier, the mausoleum?
I don't actually know. There are a number of Sufi saints buried in and around Samarkand. So it may well be, and in Shakusabs as well, actually. So it may well be that one of those tombs is from that particular saint. I would have to check for you exactly where that particular saint is buried, but there are a lot across Uzbekistan and other parts of Central Asia as well, but particularly Uzbekistan. And one of the things that is actually developing very fast now in Uzbekistan is pilgrimage tourism for Sufis from all over the world, including from the UK, going on pilgrimage to Uzbekistan to see the shrines associated with their saints.
And some of the monuments you mentioned, including the Bibi Hanım Mosque, there's a question here that's just asking whether there's a plan to open the main prayer hall of that particular mosque to the public. Do you know if there's any plans to do that? So
the Bibi Hanım, but it is a historic monument. It is not used as a place of worship. And that is the case with most of the mosques and madrasas in Uzbekistan, largely because of the Soviet history. There was a clampdown on religion. Some religious buildings were demolished, some were converted to other uses, and others were protected as historic monuments. Since independence, there have been some new mosques have been built, some have been reopened to the public, but they are a minority. The vast majority, like the Bibi Hanım, are monuments, heritage monuments, and are considered as museums. And I don't see them being, I'm not sure what the Islamic equivalent of reconsecrated is, but I can't see them being converted back into religious buildings in the foreseeable future.
Are there any particular books that you would recommend if someone wanted to research this in a little bit more detail?
There are quite a lot of biographies of Timur. The one which is probably the most accessible to a Western audience is called of Islam, Conqueror of the World, which is probably how he wanted to be seen himself. And it's by an author called Justin Marossi. But that is probably the most accessible, generally available biography of Tamerlane.
That's fair enough. I think it's just when you mentioned the title and author of that of the book, the connection just went a bit. So would you be able to repeat that for us?
Sure. So it's called Tamerlane, Sword of Islam, Conqueror of the World. And the author is Justin Marosi.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. So thank you again for everyone who has sent their questions, and thank you again for joining us. As I said, I will follow up with anyone that's answered a question with an answer to that in writing. And thank you again, Sophie. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. If anyone is interested in joining us for another lecture, Sophie is kindly doing another lecture for us on the exciting new archaeological discoveries of Central Asia. And that will be held on, I think it's Wednesday, the 14th of April at the same time. So that's 7 p.m. in the UK, but it's 2 p.m. Eastern time, US, and 11 a.m. Pacific time. So please do join us. You can register. The link is on our website and you can register there. And like I said, the session is recorded. So if you've missed any of today's session, then you can go back to our YouTube channel tomorrow and a copy will be on there for you to listen to. So thank you again, everyone, and we'll hope to see you all again soon.
Bye.